Welcome to Northlandia, a place to bring you curiosity because here you'll find curiosities. I'm Wyatt Buckner of the Duluth News Tribune, and I will be your guide as we discover the unique and fascinating stories here in the Northland. Here we celebrate the region's distinctive people, places, and history. In this episode, we look at what could have been with a downtown Duluth Mall built over Interstate 35. Let's venture forth into Northlandia. Here to talk with us about the mall that could have been, but never was, is News Tribune reporter Jimmy Lovren. Jimmy, thanks for joining us again with another installment in what seems to be a never-ending saga that is Duluth's weird history, or almost history.
Exactly, yeah. Kind of some grand ideas, some of which stick and, are great. Canal Park, maybe seemed out of the question at one point, but then there's ideas like this.
Yeah. So before we get too far into the weeds of what is this project that was proposed, how did you even find out about it?
Yeah. So I was up in the archives at our old building. So old building, 424 West 1st Street, had what was called the attic, which had, file cabinets full of photos from like the 80s, late 70s, 80s, and a little bit into the 90s, and then clippings by topic. So, every article clipped out and put in a folder based on the subject generally. And so looking through there one time a few years ago, I came across a folder, and I think it was on top of everything, unless I don't think I pulled it out of the drawer. I think it was just sitting on top categorized or something. And it was like these old plans for a mall over Interstate 35, where the skywalk is now, connecting like the deck, Duluth Entertainment Convention Center, to downtown. There's that skywalk called the Northwest Passage. Original plans for that was like a mall. Like there's going to be a mall over the interstate with 2 to 3 anchor stores. And well, that obviously didn't happen and had, been whittled down to just a skywalk. Mm-hmm. So just a hallway now, which is very handy and useful to get across. I've counted 13 lanes of traffic and a railroad. So it's a good way to cross all that, but it is no mall.
Mm-hmm. And so you kind of already touched on like what the general encapsulation of what Harbor Square maybe could have been, but just talking more like how did the idea come about in the first place, and like why doesn't it exist? Because clearly it doesn't. Those living in Duluth, I think we'd be aware if there was a mall hanging above the interstate. There is not.
Exactly. Yeah. So the 1970s, from what I understand, was really rough for Duluth and downtown Duluth, especially. There was
comparatively to now,
right?
Because there's still questions about the downtown.
Yeah. Well, the Miller Hill Mall had opened in the early 70s, and several businesses moved up there or opened another location before closing their downtown one. But there was incredibly high unemployment. The steel mill had just been closing. Not a whole lot of businesses going on. Anything new would be going up the hill to the Miller Hill Mall, and so there was kind of this last ditch attempt to revitalized downtown in the late 70s and they thought, okay, well, if malls are a thing, let's put a mall downtown, not the edge of town. Let's get them back into like the central business district and bring in some anchor stores. So the idea was to bring in a Sears, a JCPenney, and Dayton's. Well, they weren't interested at all. they nixed that. And so then the idea for it got smaller, and it would be separate from the skywalk. And then pretty soon, just the skywalk was built and no mall whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like it just kept getting smaller and smaller. It's like, that's the point now.
Right. And it was a high priority. I talked to John Fido, the mayor at the time, towards the tail end, I guess, of this. But when he was mayor, it kind of transitioned from the number one priority to basically being dropped. There was some federal community funding out there that they were going after, and this was their number one priority for that. He kind of thinks that looking back, they wasted a few years that they could have been asking for other projects when this was their number one priority. And I mean, I think the idea makes sense, right? You don't want to see a downtown that had been around for, 100 years or whatever, all of a sudden vanish or all of a sudden, it's no longer where everyone goes to shop. Or I think there used to be like free parking one day and everyone would go down there in the evening or something and shop. It was Spear Street was busy, and it had Glass Block, and it had a Sears, and it had, department stores and little shops and everything like that. So it was before malls, that's where people went. And then, And it's not just Duluth, but malls emerged. And those businesses that once went downtown were now on the edge of town or in suburbs. And downtowns suffered, and in many ways probably haven't recovered. And now malls are not doing well, so it's not really full circle. But yeah, so they had hoped to kind of put a mall downtown, fix that. Interstate 35 was under, they knew it was coming at that point. The extension, to get it through downtown was on its way. And so they tried to kind of make this project part of that.
Mm-hmm. So how exactly would they have funded this? I know you mentioned some federal dollars, but I imagine usually these kinds of projects, they needed multiple different avenues.
Yeah. Yep. And so they kind of wanted to get some federal monies. They wanted, I think the city would have chipped in, and then like the private, corporations that would have either developed it or had space there would have as well. But again, former Mayor John Fado said, the problem with that is that it's hard to put commercial space. Legally, there's that question of at the time, what about this space above an interstate? Can we put commercial property over that? A little bit east and a little bit later, when 35 went past Lake Avenue, right? They put green space in the rose gardens and
it's not a completely a unique idea to do with. I think a lot of people seem to forget or aren't even aware, don't live in the area. Even sometimes I forget. I'm like, oh, that's right. There's a section of I-35 in Duluth that literally goes underneath what is a park above.
Yep.
It's not a commercial space.
Exactly. And that was the difference. I mean, I think they kind of learned a lot from this Harbor Square idea. And a few years later, when it came to that section, like you said, you take tunnels and it's covered and helps connect downtown to the lake as best you can, I suppose. That isn't commercial. It's public. It's park. It's so that's a bit different, but yeah. And so they were going to kind of bring all these different funding sources together. Had it moved forward. But ultimately, it's also really expensive. I mean, this was going to be on stilts or on piers, pillars, whatever you want to call them, and the platform spanning, interstates at least 4 lanes of traffic. Right now, you go down there and you count the frontage roads, Railroad Street, everything like that. It's 13 lanes and a railroad, so how much this would have spanned, I don't know. But to put a platform big enough for 2 to 3 anchor stores, at one point there was parking up there too, as an idea. Plus, I'd imagine they'd want, food court or kind of space like that. That's a lot. And it's a lot less expensive to go add on to Miller Hill Mall, which is ultimately what the city supported because it was in town. They were keeping the tax, money. And so Sears, when they closed their location downtown, eventually moved up to the Miller Hill Mall. JCPenney had already had a place up there. So yeah, that's kind of how that worked out. It was very expensive, very ambitious plan, very expensive, and ultimately didn't work.
Mm-hmm. How long did they try for?
So I think that what I was finding easily was 78 to 81 was kind of the most articles were in that time period. Mm-hmm. But I was even finding stuff, in 1978 that JCPenney had backed out. And then, 3 years later, they were like, oh, we're still going to do Harbor Square. And I don't think JCPenney was in the conversation at that point, but they were shrinking it at that point. So I bet, it probably lingered a little bit longer and probably started just a little bit before that as well. But that was kind of the chunk of time where they were trying to make something happen.
Mm-hmm. Now, glancing through your article, learning more about it, sounds like there was another side of the story that involves our neighboring city, Hermantown.
Yes.
And that there was some conflict, some tension surrounding this hopefully planned mall that they wanted to build and Hermantown's own mall that they wanted to build.
Right. Yeah, so like I said, Miller Hill Mall was open by then. I think it was 73 it had opened and wasn't at the size that it was yet, but still. And then Hermantown, a little bit further down the road, wanted to build alongside Miller Trunk Highway a mall of their own called Ridgewood Mall. It would have been at kind of surrounded on 63 acres, and it would have been surrounded by Haynes, Stebner, and Arrowhead roads. And so this was proposed at the same time Harbor Square was. Duluth, seeing this, thought, well, if the Sears, which wanted to go to Hermantown, or a Dayton's or a JCPenney were to go there, that's money leaving our city. That's something we could, more people leaving downtown or fewer people coming to downtown. We should try to be attracting them to Harbor Square instead, these businesses and the people. So they sued Hermantown over this project, and we're really trying to get an environmental review, arguing more so, watershed, wetlands, trout stream, those types of issues, that the mall would be damaging that. And that, was drawn out for years. And there's a big group of, Duluth businesses, labor union, Chamber of Commerce type, organizations. And I don't know if the Chamber of Commerce exactly was involved in this, but, those types of organizations were very, you got to support Harbor Square. You got to keep it in Duluth. We want to revitalize downtown. It was kind of this, let's keep Duluth downtown vibrant or make it vibrant again, I guess. But so there was this drawn out legal process of Duluth basically trying to block this Hermantown Mall from being built. And if you've been up there, there is not a Ridgewood Mall at that intersection. It wasn't built, and neither was Harbor Square. Again, ultimately, Mayor Fido kind of said, we can't, he wasn't super comfortable with suing our neighbor. And so the writing was kind of on the wall for this project and downtowns, I suppose, it kind of became clear, like, okay, well, the Miller Hill Mall up there will kind of get on board with that. I mean, it's in Duluth. So between property tax and I think by then or around then, Duluth had a sales tax, for itself. And so, it ended up being, what he called the compromise that he was comfortable with. So, yeah, Miller Hill Mall grew. There was no Ridgewood Mall. There's no Harbor Square Mall.
Well, first off, I'm curious if there was, obviously it seemed like Duluth was like, hey, no to you. Was there a sense that Hermantown was like, hey, no to you? Or they're like, let us do our thing. We don't care what you do.
That's a good question. I think most of what I'm seeing is from the Duluth point of view.
Duluth is, looking at sheer numbers, right. It's superior power in terms of like economics and like population,
right.
So it feels like there's kind of overpowering, like, hey, no.
Yeah.
Hermantown's like, why?
Right. Yeah. I guess, most of what I saw in the archives over at the Duluth Public Library is from our paper, which probably, as best you can cover it, outside looking in. I mean, when you're a Duluth paper covering that, maybe it's more so from the Duluth point of view. I don't know. But then a lot of what they had was from this downtown organization or coalition of organizations that were advocating for Harbor Square. And so that's kind of most of the material I saw was from that point of view. The groups would put ads in the paper, encouraging people to show up and to city council meetings and stuff and keep this environmental assessment going or environmental impact statement going. So
is that, I know the story's not really about the Ridgewood Mall, but is that kind of what did it in a little bit? Was the constant suing and environmental roots? There's like, whatever, this is not worth the hassle, maybe?
Yeah, one thing I saw, and this was of a critic of that mall, was that, by the time Harbor Square was kind of dead or clear, a JCPenney or another store wouldn't be moving in, someone kind of, and I think this was critical of Ridgewood Mall, was like, well, this is the design of the 70s. This isn't going to work in the 80s. The malls have changed now. So by then, the plans had kind of aged. And again, Sears, they were in the space where the Fond du Lac Casino is downtown. And so they remained, I think they didn't close until 83, and then actually didn't have a space lined up by then because they had planned on moving to the Ridgewood Mall. Ridgewood Mall never happened, but clearly they had a Miller Hill Mall presence up until a few years ago, right? I mean, that's where one of the Essentia facilities is now, but the mall. But anyway, yeah. So yeah, I think by the time that this lawsuit, Duluth stopped fighting, I don't think there was as much interest, and I think maybe people had agreed that maybe this isn't the best for our watershed or our wetlands here is to put a big mall in parking lot. So.
All right, now shifting back to the Harbor Square Mall.
Yep.
So did anything come out of this idea? I know we have that skywalk there that passes over, which I'm grateful is there.
Yes,
I've used it many times. I haven't used it in a while, but I used to when I went to high school at Harbor City. When I started driving to school, I'd park at the deck and I'd walk over. So that I took that skywalk almost daily in high school.
Right.
So very glad that's there.
Yeah. I think that's the main thing. I mean, that's a physical thing that kind of is a, I don't know, remnant or whatever you want to call it of that, but that's there. You could argue kind of the inspiration or maybe some lessons learned inspired Duluth to then cover the interstate when they built it past Lake Avenue, right? I think the idea of keeping things connected, having, an easy way to get from downtown to the water or to Canal Park, what became Canal Park, or, what's now the deck. I mean, that's not quite where this is at, but, the idea that interstate would get in the way without some mitigation, was clear for that last bit of interstate they built in Duluth. So there's that. Sounds like, kind of the big thinking, the big ideas kind of the time of trying to get Duluth on its feet again and diversify the economy, get people to work, everything like that. Because again, the 70s were really rough. And, Canal Park came out of that, right? I mean, maybe not directly out of the Harbor Square project, but that kind of thinking meant, they could take, a really industrial area of the city with a little junkyard up against the water and turn it into some place that people flock to, visitors flock to. The deck it was the Duluth Arena Auditorium. Now it's a movie theater and a curling rink and another sheet of ice, another stadium, right? And Symphony Hall, I guess that was probably there already. But, it's expanded a lot. And, it's kind of blended into Canal. And then today, right, we're talking about possibly, reimagining that whole I-35 corridor through downtown Duluth.
Which leads into the next question, because, forewarning in advance for my fellow Duluthians who loathe construction, I-35 is due for some replacements. Right. And it's not just we're going to change it just for the heck of it. It's due for replacement.
Yep.
So how does that failed project fit into the conversation that's happening now with the reimagining of I-35?
Right. Yeah. So there's a group, Duluth Waterfront Collective. It was founded by Jordan Vanderhagen, and he, kind of proposed the idea of replacing the interstate through downtown Duluth with a parkway. There could be more buildings in between. It'd be easier for pedestrians to get from downtown to the deck and canal. It would be seamless. There are places, we're talking about the tunnels under the gardens and stuff where, it's more connected, but the grades are different, right? You're above that, you're quite a ways above the lake walk. So, that proposal is more of a smooth transition. You don't have to go find the skywalk. That's hard to find the entrance to, or and so that is happening now. There's some grant funding to look at different options, federal grant funding to look at reimagining that corridor. And when I asked him about what, he knew about Harbor Square because he had worked at a firm that had a role in designing it here in Duluth, and then he had gone through some of the old drawings. I don't know if he was aware of it from that or from his, probably days and weeks and months of I-35 research, but he was aware of it, and he said, they were, when I-35 was about to be built, they knew connectivity was important in this part. They knew that was going to be an issue and that they wanted to address it, but they kind of did more of a piecemeal patchwork way of solving that, right? Whereas what his group is proposing is supposed to be more seamless, right? Still a ways off from any sort of final, this is going to happen kind of thing, but that idea that an interstate divides Duluth from its waterfront and Duluth from Canal Park and the deck, that existed back then, and this mall was one way that they were going to link them back together with knowing that I-35 was on its way.
So with that, I know it's not in the conversation specifically with what he's proposing, but do you think there's ever a chance that Harbor Square could ever be revived, where someone could come out of the woodwork and be that's the solution. We need to, as we replace I-35, revisit this Harbor Square idea and rebuild this mall. We're going back to malls to revitalize downtown, because downtown's still a topic of concern. Obviously we still have some businesses there. It's not like downtown's gone away, but it's still a hot topic of conversation even now, 40 years later.
Yeah. Well, Sears does not exist in the way it did then, nor does Dayton's. JCPenney still does. But malls, I don't think, many malls are being proposed and built today.
But that's why it's revolutionary,
right?
Jimmy.
Yeah. So I think Harbor Square as that as that would be very, very outdated. I mean, I think right now the conversation around revitalizing downtown Duluth has been, street level shops and things to do and stuff, and then also housing, right? Since the pandemic, there are fewer workers downtown, right? I mean, if you go to the Skywalk at lunch, there are, noticeably fewer people. I mean, that used to be the busy time, office workers, but people work from home now. Not everyone, but there's a noticeable difference, right? And so now, but things are being converted to housing. Historic Central High School has, I think, just opened or is about to, and then the Ordine building over across from the Maurice's building, that is going to be converted to apartments. And I know there are others. Oh, the old jail behind the courthouses off Masava, that's been converted to housing. So I think the idea is maybe there will be people here more than just during, from 9 to 5, and maybe hungry more than just at noon. And maybe that will spur some more street level activity. I think, it's not like there's none, but really where that's at is over, when you get east at Lake Avenue is kind of where it feels like things pick up a little bit, as long as you're in Superior Street. And then it's very different once you go up a block. But so I think the idea now for revitalizing or re-energizing downtown is housing instead of office space. I mean, office space will always still be here, but hasn't been growing since the pandemic. And so converting some of that they can to housing or building housing and street level type businesses that people will want to come down here for. And then obviously there's the big argument about, or the big argument that getting rid of 35 would help reconnect downtown to where there's also already lots of activity at the deck, Canal Park. You bridge that gap, or maybe not bridge. If we're talking bridge, we already have that. If you eliminate that gap and make it seamless, I guess is probably what their argument is then, that gives you more space to put things like new housing or businesses or what have you. And maybe that'll help make things feel alive again. So yeah, I don't know if they would ever span a building over a road like that. I mean, the new Essentia building goes over First Street, but it's not the mall scale. It's just got a small portion, and that 2 lanes is quite a bit different than the gap that this mall would have spanned. So, and I don't know if it'd be totally unheard of to see a road go through or under a building. I don't think it would be 13 lanes of traffic in a railroad. That's a lot. I mean, that's not counting sidewalk and all that stuff either. So it's a huge space that this would have spanned.
Mm-hmm. Can you imagine a scenario where they did build it, and I wonder how to be doing today,
I don't know. I don't think it would be. Would
it suffer the same fate as the other malls have kind of been feeling,
Right. I asked Jordan what he thought, had it been built, and he said, well, it probably would have been great for a couple decades, but malls haven't done well lately, as we said. And so, again, if it was a Sears and a Dayton's, those would be gone.
Well, I guess another, maybe a more relevant issue that I just thought of that could come from that, because we're talking about how they have to remove I-35 because it's expired. How would that have worked if there was a mall over it?
Yeah.
Would they have to tear the mall down to be able to get to the interstate?
Right. Maybe the mall wouldn't be standing anymore, right? I mean, maybe that would have been torn down a long time ago. So add not only for sure would have been expensive to build, and then at what point would it have just become an empty shell that, they destroyed, they got rid of? I don't know if it'd still be standing today, and if it was, or maybe, it would not be probably the mall that they envisioned.
Or maybe more like, what many of our current downtown buildings is just empty buildings.
Right. Vacant space. Maybe it'd be converted to housing, although that's really difficult because there aren't, there are no exterior windows in some of those buildings, in like anchor store buildings, right? Mm-hmm.
No, I think that'd be a tough one.
Yeah. I don't think converting anchor stores to housing would be very tricky. Hard to get a lot of light in even if there were windows along the the perimeter of it. Yeah. Wouldn't want to be living in the middle of that. I don't think that'd be allowed. Yeah.
So I feel like this last half of this episode, we've kind of veered into like real news you can use, relevant things that are happening in our community and things that are actively happening in conversation. Because when that happens, whether it's with what they're talking about right now for proposal or something else, it's going to happen. And we're all going to feel that pain when that happens, as we're all constantly been lamenting the Twin Ports Interchange project, when that first started. So let's bring it back to Northlandia to wrap it up here. Why do you think it fits our quirky, interesting, curious Northlandia beyond the serious, like, relevant news we veered into?
Well, I think what got me when I saw that first was like, okay, the skywalk across the interstate was going to be a mall. You know, it's basically a hallway now, and it's useful.
It's basically a hallway.
It's basically right. But originally it was going to be like a mall, and I mean, just the idea that people thought big, and I appreciate that.
And it's a serious idea because anyone can just have an idea, like they actually went for it.
Right, and it's hard to imagine today, and I think it's just it's one of those things that it's easy, probably laugh at and point at a little bit, but it was a legitimate idea and probably could have happened and would have worked for a little bit. But malls are not what they used to be. It would have been expensive. Attitudes for interstates have changed, and I think I still get back to the idea for mall whittled down to skywalk. That's what they built. They got that part.
They just keep cutting and cutting
right
until
it's just a walkway.
All right, Jimmy, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for joining us. And listeners, if you want to see what we're talking about here, there are some renderings or drawings in your article, and I even got a drone shot overhead, so there's kind of like a side by side you can comparatively see like what was proposed versus what is now, as Jimmy described, a hallway.
Right. Yeah. No, it's I found some drawings that were copied and placed in a folder at the archives over at the Duluth Public Library, which are fun to spend a lot of time in. But anyway, old
Words
drawings.
only, Jimmy will say.
Yeah, exactly. But it just is interesting to imagine. I'm trying to figure out if the building we're in here right now, next to the Wells Fargo building, may have been part of or demolished and replaced with like a grand entrance into the mall. That's kind of what they were envisioning, because Wells Fargo building had been the glass block building. Towards the end of this era of Harbor Square ideas, glass block had the downtown location had closed. They already had a Miller Hill Mall place. So anyway, that was going to be rebuilt. Is now the Wells Fargo building, which is for sale if you're interested. But anyway, that was kind of, it's the entrance into the skywalk now, but I think this area, this side of the block would have been the grand entrance into the mall, which we kind of got a mall across the street over at what's now the Holiday Center. It used to be the Normandy Center before, I think it was the Normandy Inn before the Holiday Inn bought it. But, again, a lot of vacant space over there. So, malls have come and gone. Mm-hmm.
I'm weirdly excited to see the comments on the story, to see if how many people are for this, against this, questioning it, and I don't know. I think that'll be interesting to read. Yeah,
there are going to be some strong opinions on this, especially because the I-35 removal brings out spirited debate.
Mm-hmm. Yup. Including, again, people saying like, oh, why tear it out at all? It's going to have to be teared out. That's going to for sure happen.
Right.
What happens after that is open to discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, whether it's kind of replaced version of it, totally different. I mean, we'll see.
Mm-hmm. All right, Jimmy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Wyatt.
And thank you for joining us in this venture into Northlandia. To read the article for this week's column, as well as see photos and renderings, visit duluthnewstribune.com/topics/Northlandia. There you can find all the episodes of Northlandia, as well as on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to support us, consider becoming a subscriber of the Duluth News Tribune at duluthnewstribune.com/subscribe. Join us again next time and discover the extraordinary stories that you just might miss if you're not in the right place at the right time, ready to step off the beaten path with no rush to return, here in Northlandia.